A judge humiliates a black veteran by asking him to take off his Medal of Honor in the middle of a courtroom. What started as a simple case quickly spirals into a battle of dignity, respect, and the true meaning of honor. What follows next shocks everyone and forever alters the career of the judge who tried to strip away the dignity of a man who had given his life for his country. Stay tuned and watch as he faces the consequences of disrespecting those who've served. The courtroom was unusually packed that morning, though no one was sure exactly why. The case, a simple property dispute over an easement, was hardly noteworthy. Yet there was something about the man who had been called to testify that drew people in. Whispers spread quickly through the room, filling the space with an unspoken curiosity, like a slow, murmuring tide. Samuel Thomas, a black man in his late 70s, walked slowly into the courtroom. His gait was steady but deliberate, as if each step had been carefully measured. His military jacket, worn with pride, bore a single, gleaming medal. The Medal of Honor, America's highest award for valor, was pinned above his heart, catching the light from the courtroom's fluorescent lamps. It was a modest display, not flaunted, but rather worn with quiet dignity, as if it simply belonged there. The eyes of the courtroom shifted in his direction as he made his way to the witness stand. Some looked at him with curiosity, some with discomfort, but everyone's gaze lingered on the medal. A few whispered among themselves, leaning in closer to see the decoration up close. Despite the whispers, Samuel kept his eyes straight ahead, moving with the calm of someone who had long since learned how to tune out the noise. Judge Juliet Hargrave, presiding over the case, had already taken her seat at the bench. Known for her cold, efficient manner, Judge Hargrave rarely tolerated any displays of sentiment or emotion in her courtroom. Her eyes quickly found Samuel's medal, and the flicker of disapproval was clear in her gaze. The judge had little patience for anything she saw as distracting from the orderly conduct of the court. The weight of that silver star, gleaming against the subdued atmosphere of the courtroom, did not sit well with her. As Samuel prepared to take the stand, Judge Hargrave leaned forward, her stern expression never wavering. She cleared her throat and addressed the room with a sharp tone, cutting through the low hum of murmurs. "Mr. Thomas," Judge Hargrave's voice rang out, "before you speak, I must ask you to remove that medal. This is a courtroom, not a memorial." The command hung in the air, thick with authority. Samuel's brow furrowed ever so slightly, but he did not flinch. The silence in the room deepened. Some people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure how to respond to this unusual moment. Others simply looked at one another, sensing the tension rising. The judge's words were final, and Samuel, after a brief pause, slowly reached up to the medal on his chest. His hands, though weathered with age, moved with the steady precision of a man accustomed to bearing weight that could not be measured in ounces or grams. With deliberate care, Samuel unclipped the Medal of Honor from his jacket and placed it gently on the wooden ledge next to the microphone. The room fell silent. The sound of the medal's soft clink as it settled on the ledge seemed to reverberate throughout the courtroom. The once vibrant symbol of honor now lay next to the microphone, stripped of its context, its dignity stripped by the judge's demand. Judge Hargrave's satisfaction was evident. She leaned back in her chair, pleased with the control she had asserted. Her gaze shifted to the attorney, who was preparing to proceed with the questioning. Samuel, however, did not appear disturbed by the loss of the medal's presence. He remained seated with his back straight, his face unreadable. His silence spoke volumes, a quiet but firm resistance to the judge's unreasonable request. As the attorney began with procedural questions about the land dispute, the weight of the moment still lingered in the room. The case was about easement rights, boundaries, and legalities, but the focus had shifted. No one was paying attention to the case anymore. All eyes were on Samuel Thomas, and all hearts were heavy with the unspoken tension in the air. A young lawyer from the opposing side attempted to press forward with questions about the land in question, but even his voice seemed distant, swallowed by the discomfort that had seeped into the room. Each answer that Samuel gave was measured, each word delivered with the quiet strength of a man who had lived a lifetime in service, both to his country and to his values. His answers were simple and clear, nothing elaborate, nothing flamboyant, just the facts. But the courtroom was no longer focused on the case. All eyes turned occasionally to the silver star that now sat silently on the ledge, abandoned by its owner, its place beside Samuel's testimony, now stolen by the weight of the judge's prideful assertion of authority. The power dynamics in the room were palpable. The veteran who had served his country with honor now stood in a courtroom where that same honor was not just dismissed but actively stripped away. Judge Hargrave, pleased with the quiet compliance from Samuel, turned her attention back to the procedural matters at hand. But a subtle shift had occurred in the room. People were no longer looking at the legal arguments. They were looking at Samuel, at the veteran, at the man who had worn that metal not for recognition, but as a reminder of a duty fulfilled, a duty that had far outlasted the confines of a courtroom. The attorney's voice cut through the silence, smooth and practiced, as he began asking the first question. "Mr. Thomas, could you please confirm your name and occupation for the record?" "Samuel Thomas," Samuel replied, his voice low but steady. "Retired. Former sergeant in the United States Army." The lawyer nodded and continued, asking about the specifics of the land dispute. Samuel answered each question without hesitation, his words clear and concise. He gave facts, precise, direct answers. Nothing more, nothing less. The attorney, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation, continued with procedural questions about the easement rights, land boundaries, and the survey maps. But it was impossible to ignore the shift in the room. While the case was supposed to be about property, it became clear that the focus had subtly shifted to Samuel. It was his stillness, his calm demeanor, the quiet authority he exuded that demanded attention. Even though the case at hand was about land, the true tension in the room was between Samuel, the elderly black veteran with a lifetime of service and sacrifice behind him, and Judge Juliet Hargrave, who had humiliated him moments earlier. Judge Hargrave, despite her earlier command to remove the medal, now seemed to shrink under the weight of the silence Samuel had imposed. Samuel's answers continued to flow, but the temperature in the room had changed. A young attorney on the opposing side, sharp, eager, and clearly confident, now stepped forward to ask a question that seemed to serve as a distraction, a way to break the silence. "Mr. Thomas," he asked, his voice dripping with a dismissive tone, "would you agree that over time, memories fade?" The question hung in the air, dismissing not only the case at hand but the very value of Samuel's experiences. The attorney's voice was casual, almost too relaxed, but Samuel's response was anything but. His eyes locked with the attorney's. In the quiet that followed, the courtroom seemed to pause. Samuel's voice was steady, unshaken, as he answered the question with a sharp clarity. "I remember the men I fought with," Samuel said, his words cutting through the air with an unmistakable weight. "I don't forget those names." The room froze. It wasn't just the words Samuel had spoken. It was how he said them. The attorney, caught off guard by the strength in his response, stumbled for a second, his composure cracking. The weight of those few words hung in the air, filling the courtroom with a heavy silence that made the walls seem to close in. The man before them wasn't just a witness. He was a soldier who had lived through things no one in that room could truly understand. And then, for the first time since Samuel had stepped into the courtroom, Judge Juliet Hargrave seemed unsure of herself. She shifted in her chair, her hands gripping the sides of the bench as if to steady herself, and glanced quickly at the silver star lying next to Samuel on the ledge. The judge's face had tightened, her earlier expression of control faltering. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. What had once been a simple property dispute had now become something more profound. The honor of a man, a veteran who had served his country with bravery, had been challenged in the very space where justice was supposed to reign. And for the first time, it wasn't Samuel who seemed out of place. It was the judge, struggling to assert her authority in a room where Samuel's silent strength had already reshaped the atmosphere. The opposing lawyer, noticing the shift in attention and the palpable tension in the room, attempted to move the questioning along, but the words no longer carried the same weight. The energy had changed. Samuel's presence had become the focal point of the room. The focus was no longer on the property dispute. It was on him, on the veteran who had quietly demanded respect in a place where respect had been denied him. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed suspended in time. The procedural questions resumed, but the weight of Samuel's quiet defiance hung over them all. Even the gallery seemed to hold its collective breath, eyes trained on the witness stand where Samuel sat, unmoving, unbowed. The silver star next to him, once an object of disdain, now seemed to glow with a quiet dignity. Its presence felt even in its absence. Samuel had not needed to speak loudly, nor had he needed to make a scene. His strength had been in his silence, in his unspoken refusal to be diminished, to be silenced. He had already won, not through words, but through the sheer force of his presence. The air in the courtroom grew heavier, the tension palpable as Judge Juliet Hargrave, clearly frustrated with the shift in focus, leaned forward in her chair, her eyes narrowing at Samuel. The room, once filled with the hum of legal proceedings, now seemed still, as if everyone was holding their breath. "Let's stay focused here." Judge Hargrave's voice sliced through the tension like a blade. Her tone was sharp, impatient. "This isn't about medals or military service. We deal in facts here, not sentimentality." The judge's eyes briefly flicked toward the silver star lying on the ledge next to Samuel, then back to the man himself. "I don't care how many medals someone's collected. You want respect, you follow the rules." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, an assertion of her authority over both the case and the very man in front of her. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen, as if the very essence of the words had sent a ripple through the room. Some members of the gallery shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to react. Others seemed to lower their eyes, not wanting to draw attention to the growing rift. But Samuel remained unmoved. In the midst of Hargrave's attempt to reassert control, Samuel slowly turned his gaze toward the judge. It wasn't with anger or resentment. There was no raised voice, no dramatic gesture. It was a simple, unbroken look, a quiet defiance that spoke louder than any words could have. His eyes were filled with the weight of a lifetime of experiences that Judge Hargrave could never understand, much less dismiss. The years Samuel had spent serving his country, the friends he had lost, the battles fought far beyond the courtroom. None of that could be conveyed in a quick retort or a passionate speech. But the judge had misunderstood the depth of the man before her. The silence that followed Samuel's gaze seemed to stretch on indefinitely. The tension was no longer just about the case at hand. The courtroom had shifted from legal proceedings to a matter of respect, honor, and sacrifice. The very principles that Samuel held dear had been challenged, not by an enemy in a foreign land, but by a woman wearing a black robe who refused to see beyond her own rules. As the questioning continued, the room felt more like a battlefield. The attorney's voice had lost some of its sharpness as the attention shifted, subtly, away from the legal case and toward the confrontation between Samuel and the judge. The attorneys, witnesses, and even the gallery were no longer focused on the land dispute. They were caught in the undercurrent of tension that had quietly turned the courtroom into a stage for something much larger, something unspoken. The focus was now on what it meant to serve, what it meant to be honored, and what respect truly looked like in a place that was supposed to be dedicated to upholding justice. For the first time in the trial, it wasn't about land rights, easement boundaries, or any of the facts that had initially brought the case to the courtroom. It was about a simple man and a simple question: what is deserved respect? Samuel's resistance was not loud. It was not brash. His refusal to engage, his steady silence in the face of Hargrave's demands, had created a tension that the judge, for all her legal knowledge and expertise, had failed to recognize. Samuel had already claimed the respect that was his by right, and he didn't need to flaunt it. The weight of the star on the ledge was more powerful than any legal decree Hargrave could issue. The quiet resistance in Samuel's eyes began to settle in the minds of those in the room. The other members of the gallery, who had initially come for a simple property dispute, now found themselves witnesses to something more profound. A lesson not just about law, but about human dignity, honor, and the silent strength of a man who had already earned everything he needed to stand tall in that room. The quiet atmosphere that settled over the courtroom was thick with meaning, and for the first time, Judge Hargrave seemed unsure of her footing. Her words had failed to reassert control. Samuel's presence, his quiet, unyielding dignity, had done something that no words from the judge could erase. Judge Juliet Hargrave seemed shaken by the unexpected turn of events. Samuel Thomas had just been forced to remove his Medal of Honor, a humiliating act that had caused an unspoken shift in the room. The judge, clearly trying to regain her authority, had tried to push the case forward, but there was no mistaking that something had changed. The tension was palpable, and all eyes were now on Samuel, still sitting quietly with the medal resting beside him. Then, from the back of the courtroom, a figure in full military dress uniform stood up. His presence was immediate, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The uniform was adorned with a variety of medals, and the distinctive shine of a Medal of Honor gleamed proudly on his chest. The room seemed to pause for a moment, the energy shifting once more. The man's very presence carried weight, a presence that made the courtroom's previous tension feel insignificant in comparison. Without a word, the man began to walk forward, his boots echoing against the marble floors with each measured step. His movements were calm, deliberate, and each step seemed to resonate with purpose. He didn't need to speak loudly. His very being commanded attention. He made his way to the front of the courtroom, stopping just a few feet from the bench where the judge sat. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The man's voice was steady, clear, and strong. It didn't raise above a normal speaking tone, but it carried with it a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. It was a voice born of years of service, of battles fought, and lives saved. Judge Hargrave, caught off guard, hesitated. She looked at the man in uniform, then glanced at the room. For the first time, her usual confidence faltered. The room, once focused on the mundane details of a property dispute, was now entirely consumed by this new presence. The spectators, who had been awaiting the next move in the trial, now held their breath, uncertain of what was about to unfold. The judge, still unsure of how to proceed, cleared her throat and nodded stiffly. "This is highly irregular," she muttered, but she gave a slight gesture for the man to continue, her authority quickly diminishing in the face of the quiet power emanating from the man before her. The man stood tall, his back straight, eyes locked onto the judge. "I've earned the right to speak," he said, his voice unwavering. "When a decorated veteran is humiliated on the stand, I believe I have the right to stand in his defense." The room was completely still, every eye now on the man who had made his presence known in such a quiet, powerful way. No one moved, not even the judge, who was now visibly uncomfortable. The silence stretched, heavy and thick, as the man in uniform stepped closer to Samuel Thomas, who remained seated, his expression calm, though the weight of the moment had shifted again. The man began to speak, not to the judge, but to the room. "I knew Samuel Thomas," he said, his tone steady but full of respect. "Before he wore that medal, he wore blood. Blood not his own. He dragged men from a burning helicopter in Cambodia. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't do it for the glory. He did it because that's what a soldier does." There was a collective intake of breath as the room hung on his words. The weight of the statement was felt by everyone present. Samuel had never asked for recognition, had never sought to use his service as a means to gain favor or attention. And yet here he was, in a room full of strangers, forced to surrender the very symbol of his sacrifice, the one thing that marked him as a man who had given his all for others. The man continued, addressing the judge directly. "What you did, Judge Hargrave, wasn't about courtroom decorum. It wasn't about following rules. It was about power. Your discomfort with something you never earned, and a quiet disrespect for a man who gave everything for his country." Judge Hargrave, clearly unable to formulate a response, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her earlier attempts at control had failed. The room had shifted away from the legal dispute and into something far more personal and far more powerful. The eyes of everyone in the room were fixed on the man in military uniform, whose words carried the gravity of a lifetime of sacrifice. The man's gaze softened as he turned to Samuel. He stepped forward, reaching for the Medal of Honor, still resting on the ledge next to Samuel. With great reverence, he picked up the medal, holding it delicately in his hands. "This," he said, holding it up for all to see, "is not jewelry. This is not decoration. It is a grave marker that happens to shine." He held it with such care, as if it was a sacred object, a symbol of everything that Samuel had given. "You didn't remove this, Sam," the man continued, looking directly at Samuel. "You surrendered it. And that's what hurts the most. You were made to surrender something that no one has the right to take away." The words were heavy, and the room fell silent once more. The significance of what had just been said lingered in the air. The man's actions, his words, were a testament to the respect he held for Samuel and for all those who had served and sacrificed. It wasn't just about the medal. It was about the principle, the honor, and the dignity that came with it. The fact that it had been stripped away in such a manner spoke volumes about the disregard that Judge Hargrave had shown. Samuel, still seated, his hands folded in his lap, looked at the man who stood before him. He didn't speak, but the look on his face was one of quiet appreciation. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. He had been humbled by the act, but in that humility, he had found something deeper. The recognition that he didn't need to wear the medal to be honored. It was his actions, his character, his sacrifice that truly defined him. The man in uniform turned back to the judge, his expression still calm, but filled with quiet authority. "You've embarrassed a war hero in public, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of a life lived in service. "The consequences of that choice are already on their way." With those final words, the man turned and walked toward the door. He wasn't seeking applause or acknowledgement. His actions had already spoken for him. As he left the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. People in the gallery began to stand, not in applause, but in recognition. They were honoring Samuel, and they were silently rejecting the judge's actions. The room was no longer focused on the legal dispute. It was focused on something much greater, the silent strength of a man who had been reduced to an object of ridicule and had risen above it with quiet dignity. Judge Hargrave sat in her chair, stunned and silent, her authority shattered in front of the very people she had tried to control. The case, which had once been about property, had transformed into a symbol of honor, respect, and what it truly meant to serve. And as the courtroom emptied, the echo of the man in uniform's words lingered, carrying with them the weight of a truth that would not soon be forgotten. Within a week, the story had gone viral. Veterans organizations, legal ethics forums, and media outlets were all discussing the events that had unfolded in her courtroom. The judge's actions had been a direct attack on respect, on honor, and on everything Samuel had represented. Within days, an investigation into Judge Hargrave's conduct was underway. Sponsors pulled out of her re-election campaign. Public figures condemned her behavior. She quietly stepped down from the bench, her career effectively ended by her own actions. As for Samuel Thomas, he returned to his quiet life. He never sought recognition for what had happened that day. He didn't need it. His service, his sacrifice, had already earned him the respect he deserved. The Medal of Honor, which had been stripped of its meaning in that courtroom, was now displayed with reverence in his home. But Samuel wore it only in his heart. His true honor came from the lives he had saved, the men he had helped, and the quiet strength he had carried with him through the years. The legacy of that moment lived on, not in headlines or courtroom drama, but in the silent recognition of a man who had served his country with dignity, and in the reminder that true honor cannot be stripped away by a judge or by any system. It is earned, and it stands even in the face of injustice. If this story touched your heart, like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful, soul-touching stories that restore faith in humanity.